In this video, let's talk about dependency inversion principle. So let's go back to our code. Here, our API definition code, which is part of ASP.NET Core, right? It is dependent on this employee's repository. And this is where our dependency problem is, we talked about in the previous video. So how do we fix this problem? The dependency inversion principle is actually the principle that is introduced to help overcome this problem. So we have two objects here, or maybe we can say we have two components here. We have a higher component, which is the web API definition, or which we call a minimal API definition components, right? So all of these are part of that component. This component, it's dependent on this lower component, which is in this case, the employee's repository. So we have a higher component that uses a lower component, which forms a dependency. And how do we resolve the dependency problem? We use the dependency inversion principle. So dependency inversion principle says that the higher component shouldn't be dependent on the lower component. Both should be dependent on an abstraction. So it inverts the dependency from each other to a third thing, right? So let's draw a diagram in order to illustrate this. So we have a higher component right here, which in this case is the API definition logic. Let's make the font bigger. All right, so we have the higher component over here, and this higher component is currently dependent on the lower component, which in this case is the repository, the employee repository. So we have this dependency from the top to the bottom, and we need to resolve this dependency. Otherwise, we have problem in our code, right? So how do we resolve the problem? We use the dependency inversion principle. Dependency inversion principle says both of these components shouldn't be dependent on each other. They should be dependent on the third thing, which is abstraction. Abstraction of what? The abstraction of the lower component. So, which means that we need to first of all create an abstraction of the lower component. And that is in C#, it's going to be an interface. So it's going to be an interface for the lower component. So therefore, this is going to be implementing this interface, which means that lower component is now dependent on the interface. And then the dependency inversion principle says that it should invert the dependency. So instead of depending on the lower component, it should be depending on this interface now. So both higher and lower shouldn't be depending on each other. They both should be depending on the abstraction, which in this case is the interface for the lower component. So this is the dependency inversion principle. We invert the dependency. So this resolves the dependency problem. So we define an interface, and then the higher component only knows about the interface, right? And the lower component also only knows about the interface. You can see both arrows goes inside, goes toward the interface. So which means that the higher component doesn't know the existence of the lower component. And the lower component doesn't know who is using itself, right? They're not aware of each other, but they're actually working with each other through this interface. So this resolves the dependency and resolves the conflicts. So the higher component wouldn't have any way to fight with the lower component or vice versa, because they're all going through a abstraction, right? And they're interacting with each other through this abstraction. This is the dependency inversion principle. And in reality, let's go into Visual Studio and try to implement that. Let's go to employee repository first. And in order to implement that, first of all, we cannot use static anymore. So let's remove static, replace static with empty space. Okay, so now it's not a static class anymore. Let's format it, Control KF, and everything is formatted Well, I think Control KF has some kind of problem in this studio version. Anyways, we have a private member, and all of these methods are becoming instance methods, right? And they are just grabbing directly from this private member. Now, this becomes the lower component, and this lower component needs to abstract it, which means we need to create an abstraction for this. And in Visual Studio, there's an easier way to do it. We just do control dot on this class, and then it says extract interface. And that's exactly what we need to do. So I hit enter, and then I click on OK. All right. So we created this interface right over here. This is actually not the best practice. The best practice is to have the concrete implementation of the interface. So here's the term, right? So this is the interface, which is the abstraction. And then when a class is implementing this interface, we call this one the concrete implementation of the interface, right? So usually the best practice is that we move the concrete implementation outside of this project, right? So that this web API is not aware of the employee's repository. That's the purpose, right? We don't want each other to be aware of each other. We want each other to be aware of this interface. But for teaching purpose, I don't want to create too many projects to confuse you. I want to keep everything inside one project because at the end, we're learning about ASP.NET Core. I don't want to spend too much time on architecture. And so let's go ahead and keep both the concrete implementation and the abstraction in the same folder. Okay, so we have this interface and we have this. Now, we just need to make the employee endpoints class to be dependent on this interface instead of the lower component. Right, so let's go into employee endpoints, and we can see that the rest squiggly lines because this is no longer static anymore, right? And we don't want to create an instance of this by, let's say, creating a new object, because when we do that, we're still having the same issue. The higher component is still dependent on the lower component. So we need to remove this. We need to use the abstraction, which is the interface. But how do we do that? How do we do that? What we can do is we can use the interface right over here. So our employees repository, and then we have the employees repository defined inside here. And then we can use it here. Okay, so how does that work? So we're going to talk about it in the next video, but in this video, let me implement this so that we can remove the squiggly lines. All right, so let's do this. And then for the next one, we're going to put it over here and change this to lowercase e. For this one, again, we're going to change this one to lowercase e. And last but not least, we are going to also do the same thing right here. Okay, so this solves our problem. But the question is, who's going to pass this employee repository into our endpoint handlers? That's what we are going to cover in the next video, where we're going to cover the inversion of control principle.